The townsfolk gathered like wolves at a scent, their boots stirring dust across the church steps where the girl knelt with torn sleeves and blood dripping down her back, her hands tied cruelly to the railings, while the preacher's voice thundered about sin and shame. No one moved to stop it. Not the women clutching their shawls tighter, not the men pretending to adjust saddles or spit chewing tobacco into the dirt. They all watched. Her name was Mercy, though no one seemed to remember that as the lash cracked again, her body jerking but her mouth refusing to cry out. They said she had stolen bread, though the baker hadn't even filed a charge. They said she had tempted a married man, though he was nowhere to be found. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was appearance, and in this town, appearance was everything, especially when the judge was on vacation and the preacher thought himself righteous enough to mete out pain. From the shadows near the blacksmith's shed, one man watched differently. His name was Eli Tanner, a quiet rancher who rarely spoke more than 2 words to anyone since the fever took his wife and son 5 winters ago. Folks called him the mute ox, strong, slow, and silent, but his eyes missed nothing. He saw the way Mercy's fingers dug into the wood with each strike, how she curled slightly to shield her ribs, how no one looked directly at her face as if doing so would make them guilty too. And then, just as the preacher raised the whip again, Eli stepped forward. Not rushed, not loud, just steady, boots crunching across gravel like thunder in a dry sky. No one had seen him coming, but everyone stopped breathing when he said, in a voice deeper than anyone remembered, "That's enough." The preacher turned, confused, the whip still raised, but something in Eli's stare made him lower it an inch. "She's not yours to punish," Eli said, and the words seemed to echo, not just off the wooden beams of the church, but inside the shameful silence that hung over every onlooker. The preacher sputtered, talked of scripture and justice, but Eli only walked to the steps, untied the girl, and lifted her in his arms like someone reclaiming something sacred. Her blood smeared his shirt, but he didn't flinch. Mercy's eyes fluttered open just once, catching a glimpse of the man who didn't ask what she did or what she deserved. He just carried her away, while no one, not even the preacher, dared follow. Eli Tanner's cabin sat 2 miles past the last fence post, hidden by scrub pine and wild thistle, a place where the wind spoke louder than men and memories hung heavier than curtains. No one visited, not since his wife, Clara, and their boy died coughing through the winter when the medicine ran out, and the preacher claimed it was God's will. Eli had buried them beneath the juniper tree and built the cabin himself, every board nailed in silence, every wall meant to hold in the hurt. Now, for the first time in years, he kicked open the door not for himself, but for Mercy, whose blood had soaked through his shirt and left a trail across the floor as he laid her gently on the bed his wife once slept in. She didn't speak, her eyes barely fluttered. Her back was raw and torn, the whip marks still oozing where the skin had split. Eli didn't have the words for comfort, never did, but his hands moved with quiet certainty, boiling water, grinding herbs, stitching torn flesh with the same care he'd once used on his son's favorite doll when the seams burst. As night fell, the fire crackled and the shadows danced across Mercy's face, and Eli sat nearby, his chair creaking softly as he watched the rise and fall of her breathing. He hadn't meant to interfere. He never did. But something about the way she didn't scream, the way she held herself even as the crowd stripped her of dignity, something in that reminded him of Clara, who had died with her jaw clenched and her eyes dry so Eli wouldn't feel helpless. He didn't know Mercy's story yet. Didn't know who she loved or who she lost, or why no one stood up for her. But he knew this. Pain should never be a sermon, and God never asked for blood on his doorstep. Outside, Coyotes yipped at the edge of the woods, and Eli loaded his rifle without a sound, knowing the town might come looking come morning. They always did when their guilt grew louder than their pride. But tonight, here in the cabin with no cross on the wall, he let mercy rest, let the silence wrap around them both like a prayer, too sacred to speak aloud. And in that stillness he realized something had shifted, not just in her, but in him too. For the first time in years, he wasn't remembering what he'd lost. He was protecting what he might still have. Word spread fast in towns like Wren Hollow, faster than mail, faster than rain. And by the next morning, everyone from the saloon girls to the schoolmaster knew that Eli Tanner had carried Mercy Hayes from the church steps, like she was something more than a thief, more than a disgrace. Some whispered he'd lost his mind, reliving his grief through a broken girl. Others muttered that Mercy had bewitched him, that maybe she was no victim at all but a temptress who now had her claws in the quietest man the town had left. But deep down, what they feared most wasn't madness or magic. It was mercy. Because if Mercy Hayes deserved protection, then maybe their silence yesterday was a sin too great to bury. Sheriff Billings, never one to stir unless money was involved, rode up to Eli's cabin that noon, boots crunching over last year's pine needles. He didn't bother knocking. Eli opened the door before he reached it, rifle in hand, but pointed low, the message clear enough. "We just want to talk," the sheriff said, eyes shifting toward the window where a flicker of blonde hair moved behind curtain cloth. "Ain't safe, her being here. Folks are riled." Eli didn't say a word, just stepped aside enough to show that he wasn't hiding her. He was guarding her. Sheriff Billings scratched his jaw, uneasy. "You're stirring things, Eli. Folks remember what you lost. They respect that. But this makes them nervous." Eli didn't blink, didn't move. And finally, the sheriff rode off, leaving behind a silence thicker than before. Inside, Mercy sat upright now, bruises yellowing along her jaw, back still wrapped in cloth Eli had boiled twice over. "They'll come," she said hoarsely. "They always do, for girls like me." Eli looked at her for a long moment, then said only, "Not this time." Mercy didn't believe him, not yet. But she watched the way he moved around the cabin, the way his grief didn't make him smaller, but somehow steadier, and it planted something deep inside her she hadn't felt since before her mother died. A root of belief that maybe safety wasn't a lie. That night, the wind picked up, and the oil lamp flickered across the room, casting their shadows onto the wall. One tall, silent, and strong, the other broken, healing, and quietly watching. And outside, far down the ridge, the first townsman stepped out with a rifle and fear in his belly. Not because of what Mercy had done, but because of what Eli Tanner might still do to protect her. The next morning came heavy with gray skies and colder air, as if the land itself braced for something it couldn't name. Mercy stirred slowly, wincing with each breath, but her eyes no longer held the dull glaze of someone waiting to be punished. She watched Eli move about the cabin, silent as always, but never distant. He boiled water, poured coffee, cut slices of sour bread hard from 3 days' age. He didn't ask if she could eat. He just placed the cup beside her and went back to the fire. Mercy had known plenty of men who acted kind until they wanted something. But Eli Tanner had done something stranger than any kindness. He hadn't asked a single question. Not where she came from, not what she'd done, not what the preacher had accused her of. She wanted to tell him anyway, that she hadn't stolen bread. She'd been given it by the baker's boy, a friend from childhood, and the preacher had seen her take it with no money exchanged. That her mother had died in childbirth, and her uncle, who took her in, did worse things than hunger ever could. That she ran the first chance she got. But the words didn't come. What came instead was the sound of a knock. Not the pounding of a mob or the heavy fist of the sheriff, just 3 small, cautious taps. Eli moved to the door, rifle in hand, but lowered again. When he opened it, there stood a woman, Mrs. Lillian Carr, the widow who ran the dry goods store. She didn't speak right away, just held out a fresh loaf wrapped in cloth. "It ain't poisoned," she said, her voice dry but shaking. "I just figured maybe she could use something soft to chew." Eli took it with a nod, and Lillian's eyes darted past him toward Mercy. "I didn't speak up," she whispered, guilt bleeding into every word. "I should have. But the preacher, he's loud, and people listen when they're scared." Eli didn't answer, but Mercy stepped forward then, every step an ache, and said, "Thank you." Just 2 words. But they cracked something open. Lillian nodded quickly, turned, and hurried off like she feared she might change her mind if she lingered. When Eli closed the door, he found Mercy crying, not from pain, but from the sheer, unfamiliar weight of being seen without scorn. Outside, in the hush that followed, other things shifted too. A shadow moved behind a tree line, a rifle lowered, and somewhere in town, a preacher paced, angry that his gospel had not made her disappear. By the 5th evening, the whispers had grown legs. Some folks in Wren Hollow said Eli was building a militia in the hills, others that Mercy had cursed the preacher, turned his sermons dry and joyless. But no one dared ride up again, not since word spread that Eli stood on his porch every sunset with his rifle slung like it was a part of him. At dusk, as the light bled red across the valley, Mercy sat at the cabin window, her back still aching but stronger now, watching Eli as he moved through his small daily rituals. She couldn't explain the comfort it brought. How a man so quiet could silence the panic in her chest with nothing but his presence. She'd watched so many men bring chaos. Eli brought calm. That night, as he came back from gathering wood, she noticed something different. A second saddle lay by the barn door, smaller, older, worn down at the edges. She hadn't seen it before. "Was it your son's?" she asked softly as he passed. Eli paused, his jaw tightening. Then he nodded. "You still ride?" she asked, unsure if the question would push too far. He looked at her, then the saddle, then said, "Not since." That was all. Not since. And yet he hadn't thrown it away. Mercy stood slowly, pressing a hand to the doorframe to steady herself. "Maybe, someday," she said. "We both might again." He didn't answer, but he didn't shut the barn either, and that, to Mercy, meant something. The next morning, when she stepped outside for the first time, the valley greeted her with cold air and quiet dignity. Birds chirped warily, a deer startled in the brush, and on the porch railing, a small bouquet of wildflowers waited, delicate and messy, like a child had picked them. Mercy blinked back tears. Eli noticed but said nothing, just poured coffee into her cup and turned back to the field. But Mercy knew. Somewhere out there, someone had come close enough to leave that bouquet, and yet Eli had let them go. Mercy wasn't sure what she felt. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of forgiveness. Not for others. Not yet. But for herself. Inside, the preacher's words still echoed in her memory, each lash justified with a psalm, each wound sown with guilt. But Eli Tanner had never quoted scripture, never asked her to repent. He simply gave her space to heal. And sometimes, that felt like the loudest kind of love. That night, Mercy awoke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Not boots on the porch, but soft, crunching in the underbrush, careful, but not practiced. She sat up, heart racing, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife Eli had placed under her pillow 2 nights ago, without explanation. The fire still burned low in the hearth, casting flickering orange light across the walls. Eli wasn't in his chair. He was already outside. Mercy moved to the window and saw him standing at the tree line, rifle loose in his hands, eyes fixed on something or someone just beyond the dark. She couldn't see who. But then she heard the faintest shuffle, and a boy's voice, no older than 10, murmured, "Mister, I didn't mean to scare nobody." Eli said nothing, only motioned with his head, and the boy stepped into view, thin, filthy, and shaking. Mercy recognized him instantly. Levi Kemp. Orphaned last year when his mother died of fever, and his pa drank himself into a grave trying to forget her. The town had pretended not to see him afterward. "He's hungry," Mercy said, already reaching for bread. By the time Eli brought the boy inside, the cabin's silence had changed. Not broken, but reshaped. Levi clutched the bread like it might vanish if he blinked. He wouldn't meet Mercy's eyes, but he sat close to her on the floor, as if proximity to someone once whipped made his own wounds feel less alone. Eli didn't ask questions. He never did. But Mercy found herself speaking anyway, her voice gentler than she'd expected. "You'll sleep here tonight, Levi, and you'll eat tomorrow. That's the only plan." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, then looked toward the fire and asked, "You gonna send me back?" Mercy glanced at Eli, whose face softened just slightly. "No," she said. "You're not going back to people who forgot you." And in that moment, Mercy understood something Eli had been teaching her without words. The only way to heal what the town broke was to build something stronger from its ruins. A woman, a rancher, and a boy, none of them whole, none of them saints, but all of them stubborn enough to stay. Outside, the fire in the lantern flickered low but never went out. And for the first time since Mercy had arrived, the wind felt less like a threat and more like a witness, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath for what might grow in the ashes of what the town tried to destroy. At dawn, smoke curled above Wren Hollow's chapel, not from incense or offering, but from dry brush burning behind the preacher's quarters, a ritual he performed when he felt the town slipping from his grip. Preacher Mathis stood in front of the flames with his hands raised, calling down brimstone in the name of righteousness, his voice carrying across rooftops like thunder too long bottled up. "There is rot in our roots," he cried, eyes wild. "A woman, whipped for her sin, now finds shelter in the home of a man once upright, and a child, filthy, unsaved, lurking in that place. If the law won't purge it, then God will." The crowd gathered slowly, unsure, uneasy. Some nodded. Others looked to their feet. A few women exchanged glances and tightened shawls around their children, remembering Mercy's screams on the church steps and wondering, quietly, if they'd been on the wrong side of history. Meanwhile, miles away, Eli stood sharpening his axe beside the cabin while Levi fed kindling into the hearth. Mercy watched them both, a knot of dread forming in her gut. Something was coming. She felt it in her bones, in the way the forest birds flew off too early, in the way Eli's silence grew heavier by the hour. She'd wanted to believe the town might turn toward grace, that the loaf from Lillian Carr was a beginning, not an exception, but now she feared it had only provoked the man who called himself God's mouthpiece. That afternoon, a stone landed on the cabin roof with a thud. Then another. When Eli stepped outside, no one was there. But a crude drawing was pinned to the fence, a woman with devil's horns, a baby goat in her arms, and flames licking at their feet. Mercy's breath caught. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He'll come here." Eli said nothing, just untied the paper, folded it once, and tossed it into the fire without a word. Mercy watched it curl into ash, then turned toward Levi, who had gone quiet again, his small hands clenching the arm of the chair, She knelt beside him. "You're safe here," she said softly. "Whatever they say, whatever they do, you're not going anywhere." Levi nodded, but his eyes stayed on Eli, looking for a truth deeper than words. And when Eli gave him a slow, solemn nod, the boy finally exhaled. Mercy rose and stood at the window, watching the distant smoke above the chapel rise higher than the trees, and she knew the preacher wouldn't be content until someone else burned. That night, the wind shifted. It carried the smell of pine and smoke and something else, something mean and old and righteous. Mercy stayed close to Levi as he slept near the fire, but her eyes never left the window. She knew Preacher Mathis wouldn't act alone. Men like him didn't wield knives. They whispered into ears until someone else picked them up. Just after midnight, a branch snapped outside. Then another. Eli was already awake. He didn't reach for his rifle. He picked it up slowly, deliberately, like he'd rehearsed this moment in silence for years. He met Mercy's eyes only briefly, then stepped onto the porch. A voice rang out in the dark, slick with false grace. "Eli Tanner, come out and speak like a man." Mercy recognized it. Jacob Rowe, the blacksmith's son, one of the preacher's loudest followers. Eli said nothing. "That woman you're protectin', she's poison," Jacob shouted. "The boy's a thief. This ain't no home, it's a nest for ruin. Step aside." Inside, Mercy rose, heart pounding, reaching for Levi's hand. The boy clung to her, eyes wide, silent. Outside, Eli stepped off the porch into moonlight, the rifle across his chest. "You think we forgot who you were before her?" Jacob said. "Your wife's grave still fresh, and now you play savior to a harlot and a stray?" Another man moved behind him, and another. 5 in total. Faces blurred by firelight, nerves masked by drink. Eli didn't flinch. "You done?" he asked, low and even. Jacob blinked. "You threatening us?" Eli shook his head. "I'm reminding you," he said. "I buried a son and a wife. I've got nothing left you can take, but I got just enough strength left to keep what's mine now." Behind him, the cabin door opened. Mercy stepped out, shoulders straight despite the healing bruises, and stood beside him. Not behind. Beside. "You'll have to beat a child again to make your point," she said, her voice clear. "You willing to wear that weight?" Silence fell. Then one of the men, younger, jittery, lowered his torch. "Ain't what I came for," he mumbled, backing away. Another followed. Jacob's eyes flicked between them, fury bubbling. But when Eli didn't move, didn't blink, Jacob turned and spit on the ground. "This town's sick," he hissed, "and you just made it sicker." They left without a shot, just silence and footsteps. Eli turned to Mercy then, slower now, shoulders sagging, but eyes steady. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's ours now." And in that truth, the fire behind them finally went out, but not the one they'd lit between them. By morning, word had spread. Not because anyone spoke it loudly, but because Wren Hollow was the kind of town where silence traveled faster than sound. The preacher didn't show for his morning sermon. Jacob Rowe didn't open the blacksmith's forge. And for the first time in months, the town square was quiet. No shouting, no gossip, just glances passed between windows and doors. Eli sat on the porch, sharpening an old blade, not because he needed to, but because old habits die slow. Inside, Mercy stirred a pot of stew, her movements slow but sure, and Levi swept the floor like it mattered, like clean planks could protect them from memory. Then, just before noon, a knock came. Not harsh, not hurried. Mercy opened the door to find Mrs. Carr again, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood 2 women Mercy had never spoken to. Alma Griggs, whose husband drank too much, and young Hattie Bloom, whose baby had died last winter. None of them spoke right away. Mrs. Carr finally held up a loaf of bread. "Still ain't poisoned," she said softly, "but I figured you might need more than one." Alma stepped forward next. "We weren't brave," she said. "Not until you were." Hattie didn't speak. She just reached into her shawl and handed over a spool of red thread. "For your boy," she whispered. "He's not mine," Mercy began, but then paused. "He is now." Eli stood behind her, arms crossed, saying nothing, but the edge of his mouth curled almost imperceptibly. The women came in, sat quietly, shared bread, and left just as quietly. But something had changed. Word of that visit would spread too, just like the smoke had. Later, Levi asked Mercy, "Does this mean it's over?" She knelt beside him. "No," she said. "It means the fire went out where it was meant to burn, and now something else might grow." That evening, Eli took down the second saddle from the barn wall. He oiled the leather, tested the straps, then set it beside Mercy, without a word. She touched it with reverence, then smiled. "Someday," she said, "I think we'll all ride again." In the quiet that followed, a red bird landed on the porch rail. Levi watched it with wide eyes. "Think he's got a name?" he asked. Mercy looked at the bird, then Eli, then the boy. "Why don't you ask him?" she said. And as Levi whispered to the bird, the sun dipped low over Wren Hollow, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the town was listening. Spring arrived quietly, not with parades of color but with small defiant signs, buds pushing up through dry earth, the soft gurgle of the stream behind Eli's barn running a little faster, and birds returning to the eaves as if they'd never left. Mercy stood barefoot outside the cabin one morning, the hem of her dress brushing wild thyme. Her eyes closed as she breathed in air that no longer smelled like smoke or fear. Behind her, Levi laughed, an unguarded, belly-deep sound, as Eli gently tossed a carved wooden horse toward him. Mercy turned to watch the boy catch it and cradle it like treasure. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and Eli had made it for him. Just then, from the path below the ridge, the crunch of wagon wheels sounded. Not fast, not angry, just steady. Mercy stepped forward instinctively, shielding Levi, but Eli stood at her side now, calm as ever, rifle across his back but hands at ease. It was Lillian Carr again, this time with her husband, and behind them, a cart stacked high with supplies. "We figured," Lillian called, "you might be planting soon." Behind them came others. Not a crowd, but enough. Mr. Harrow with seed, the Thompson girl carrying a chicken in a basket, and even old Widow Bell with a sack of flour balanced on her hip. They didn't say, "Sorry." They didn't have to. Mercy nodded slowly and stepped aside to let them in. The yard became a flurry of movement. Baskets set down, seeds handed off, small, awkward kindnesses offered without strings. At one point, Levi reached out and took Alma Griggs's hand. She looked startled, then knelt and kissed his knuckles. "You've grown," she whispered. Inside, Mercy found herself by the window again, the same one she had stared from on her first broken day in the cabin. But now, the view had changed. Not just the light or the faces, but something deeper. The land felt like it belonged to her, not by deed, but by endurance. That night, after the neighbors left and the sky turned lavender with dusk, Eli handed her a small, wrapped bundle. Inside was a carved necklace, simple wood, shaped like a bird in flight. "For when you forget," he murmured, "that you flew." Mercy pressed it to her chest, eyes stinging. "I won't forget," she said. And as she looked out across the land they'd nearly lost, she whispered to the wind, "They tried to take everything, but not this. not us. The valley stayed silent, but in that silence, she heard it, the sound of a town learning to heal.